Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask, what will it take for a woman to become President of the United States? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. No woman has ever been President of the United States. Indeed, only 2 women have ever been nominated as candidates for that office by one of the 2 main parties. So what's causing this problem, and how might it be overcome? Well, a new article in our partner journal, the Political Quarterly, explores exactly these questions. It's by Rosie Campbell, who is Professor of Politics at King's College London, and Johnny Lewandowski, who is Professor Emerita at Birkbeck College and Visiting Professor at the Policy Institute at King's College London. And I'm delighted that Rosie and Johnny both join me now. Welcome, both of you, to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's wonderful to have you on. And could we maybe start by putting the United States in context a little bit? I mean, we know that underrepresentation of women is a problem everywhere. So, Johnny, is the US an outlier in this respect?
I think the US always thinks it's an outlier, and in fact it is on the elder edge of what we used to think of as established democracies in terms of its women's representation in a variety of ways, not only in the failure to have a head of state who was a woman, but also in terms of its representation in various congresses, state houses, governorships, and equivalent elected offices. I think women are, just under 30% of members of Congress.
Which compares, for example, with 40% in the UK, so there's at least a bit of a difference there.
Yeah, well, there's a bigger difference because it took them a lot longer to get there. It's only very recently been that high.
10 percentage points, quite a big gap.
Yeah. And then there are around 30% of statewide executives, around 34% of state legislatures. So it's not wildly different, but it's behind, it's slower than most of the equivalent countries. If we go to the Inter-Parliamentary Union data on women's representation, we'll find that there are a few other countries at this level and a few below, but basically it's not got anything to be proud of women's representation-wise.
And Rosie, in terms of executive offices, I guess many countries have now had women as heads of government, but it's far from being a majority. It's still very much a minority of countries that have had.
Indeed, but then you can look at countries that in many ways have a lot in common with the US, the UK, at least historically a 2-party majoritarian system, and we've had 3 women prime ministers. So I think the outlier argument still holds. Okay,
so at least in part we're looking at a phenomenon that is particular to the United States. Presumably there are also kind of general cross-national patterns underpinning this as well. Let me put a really big and broad question to you. Rosie, maybe we can start with you on this and see where you go with it. So what barriers do women face as candidates for president in the United States?
Well, it's such a unique office. I mean, I think if you think that Johnny's just listed the representation of women in politics at different levels, often talking about a third, and yet the route to becoming president is not the same route as becoming prime minister. It's, a unique office in terms of the fact that you don't necessarily have to climb through the party hierarchy to get there. And the buckets of money that's involved to get the opportunity to stand for election as president of the United States is another huge factor that makes it different from a lot of other established democracies.
Johnny?
Well, the sums of money involved are actually grotesque. It's not just large. It's off the scale in terms of being able to comprehend it. As it happens, I think women are able to raise money for their candidacies, but they rely more on small donors. Women are not even a large minority of the actual donors and so forth and so on. So it's a pathway that is got quite a male dominance at almost every stage of the way.
So at least one institutional factor that's involved here is just the role of money, and as you say, huge amounts of money in US politics. I guess another sort of unusual feature of US politics is the primary system through which candidates are selected for candidacy in the first place. Is that also a factor in shaping what's going on here?
Well, we think it is. It is a real marathon. It takes a couple of years to build yourself up to get through the primary system and in a position to be nominated by your party. And the primaries consist of a lot of different systems of selection, which in turn attract differential levels of media reporting and produce different notions of whether or not somebody's electable. So essentially 12 people riding around in a pickup truck in Iowa can blow somebody's chances right out of the water.
Rosie, do you want to add to that?
I think it matters enormously, but I also think there is some nuances to how it matters, depending on which party and which... But I guess the big difference is that supporters of parties are acting as gatekeepers, and they can be a little bit different from voters, and how they're different from voters differs across the parties in terms of the way they respond to women candidates.
Do you want to just develop that thought?
Yes.
What is that difference?
So there actually, surprisingly, isn't a huge amount of hostility to women candidates in the US now. Maybe the president is a slightly unique office, but more generally for elected office. So it's not necessarily that there's this sort of ingrained bias against women candidates, but there are subtle stereotypes and biases that apply. And Republican supporters are slightly more likely to prefer a male candidate. But also it's about whether women candidates are perceived as being more left or more right-wing, or in US terms more liberal or more conservative. And across the board, women candidates are considered to be slightly more liberal. So that means that on the Democrat side, you would think that a woman candidate's more likely to be to the left of the party, whereas on the Republican side, a woman candidate's more likely to be towards the centre. Now, that really makes a difference to which cohorts of voters are going to prefer or be biased against women candidates, and it's this interaction with their presumed politics with their gender.
So if I understand correctly, you're suggesting there are two factors there that might make it particularly hard for a woman to get the Republican nomination. So one factor there is just potentially that Republicans are more likely to be hostile to women as candidates,
Slightly,
as
yes.
holders of political office. And then secondly, if women are generally perceived as being more left-wing, and Republicans who are choosing a candidate are likely to want to choose a candidate who is clearly on their side and is going to kind of fly the flag for their side of the political contest, then for that reason as well, they're going to be less likely to choose a woman candidate.
For reasons of political expediency, the more centrist candidate is probably more attractive to voters. And yet the voters in primaries are not looking necessarily for the most attractive candidate for swing voters. They're looking for the champion of their cause, as you describe. And so that might well push the slate to the right and disadvantage women candidates.
No, and in some sense, I suppose the electors and the organisers in primaries play the role of party activists, because they're probably not representative of the beliefs that are obtained in the country as a whole. They're probably somewhere to whatever direction it is from the centre. And it's a functional equivalency because they don't look anything alike. But there is that, I suppose, slight radicalism that you get on the ground.
The primary voters potentially face a couple of options in terms of how they think about the choice that is before them. Either they're thinking about who is the flag bearer from my ideological position, or they're thinking about who is going to win this election for my side. And this could actually take them in different directions, these two different considerations in terms of the kind of candidate they would vote for in a primary.
Yeah, and I don't actually know what any research on the mind of the primary voter tells us. Do you?
Actually, I have to admit that I don't know the distinction there. We can only look at who they vote for.
And that's a really interesting comment, because I was wondering when you said that we know that Republican voters are less likely to favour women candidates. Is the evidence for that based simply on who they in fact vote for, or are we doing kind of experimental evidence here to see what candidates they in fact vote for if you do a more kind of controlled comparison of candidates?
The evidence is a mixture of both sort of experimental, hypothetical situations and observational data about real-world elections. And as I said, it is fairly small these days. There used to be huge hostility to women candidates. Now there's a residual small disadvantage amongst Republican voters and not amongst Democrat voters. And the evidence is that it's still there, but it's diminished massively in size.
So we have these kind of interactions between institutional factors and attitudinal stuff going on, and it's the way these two play relative to each other that shapes the outcomes. Another kind of institutional factor that you mention in the article is the core of the electoral system itself. And it's certainly long been argued that first-past-the-post electoral systems, which basically we can say the presidential election system is, are hostile to women. They make it harder for women to gain office. Is that a kind of relevant factor here as well?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I still believe that first past the post does necessarily make it harder for women. I think it used to make it harder for women to make careers in the first place and get into the pool of entry. But over time, as women have marched through the political parties, this has, I think, shifted. There's only a few examples globally, so it's very, very difficult to get very far with that, I suppose.
I suppose one of the things that makes a huge difference in terms of that cohort of women politicians at other levels of elected office is that in many countries around the world, parties on the left, the centre left, have used quotas in order to increase the representation of women. And of course that hasn't happened in the US. So even though there are high representation of women among Democrat elected officials and Republicans, that's still considerably lower than the equivalent representation in, say, the UK Labour Party or the Australian Labour Party.
So the pool of potential applicants or candidates for the role of president is more male skewed?
Well, I don't know that that's quite the way it works, in that recent presidents aren't always people who have previously held elected office. So yes. There are other ways in. But I do think in terms of having the mobilisation of women normalised and mainstream within the party, that is an issue.
There's also sequencing of once one party does it, it puts pressure on the other parties to come up with some mechanism or other to compete in that way if they think it's important. Not all parties will do it, but most of them do.
Okay, so far we're exploring underlying theory and general patterns about the sorts of barriers that women face in getting elected as president in the United States. How could a woman overcome these various barriers? You talk in the article about various scenarios in which we can imagine a woman potentially getting through and getting elected. One of these scenarios is simply a woman becomes the candidate for president for one of the main parties and that woman is elected. But there are other potential routes as well.
Yes, I think we can rule out that scenario for now.
Do you want to just pursue that a little bit further? Because some people might say Hillary Clinton, she did win the popular vote in 2016.
Yes, we haven't mentioned the Electoral College, actually, in terms of the distortions of electoral systems.
Yeah. Why is the Electoral College relevant?
Well, as far as I know, there's nothing in particular about the Electoral College that's anti-women. It's just pretty anti-democracy, I suppose, is what's wrong with it.
I suppose some people would argue that because it favours small states, and the small states on average are a bit more conservative than...
Well, yeah, I think what they really mean is it favours Republicans.
Why?
Because small states, which happen to be largely, or were until a few months ago, largely Republican-leaning, by small I mean small in population, largely Republican-leaning, are overrepresented in the Senate in particular as a result of this Electoral College. Yeah. And there are also some other things about it, so that the way in which the Electoral College vote is determined actually varies quite a bit by state. And I would hazard a guess that the overwhelmingly Republican small population states have rather less open and democratic ways of making those determinations.
Okay. I've allowed us to get very slightly sidetracked. So you made a very interesting statement there that you think it's very unlikely that we're going to see a woman elected through that kind of first route anytime soon. Why do you think that?
Because it's never happened.
Well, also because the example that you give in 2016, lots happened since then.
Yeah.
You know, the environment has got so much worse. If we look at indicators about online hostility towards politicians, harassment, how that moves into real world harassment, intimidation, abuse, and all of these things have grown in many countries, including the US, and they have a particular gendered nature. Women are more likely to receive rape threats, sexualized threats. And then, of course, the rise of the manosphere, of the kind of really anti-gender equality rhetoric that was not the mainstream 10 years ago. All of these things make us think that a woman being successful at the next presidential election would probably take a miracle. But, really strange, unusual events do happen. So we don't want to rule it out completely, but we're not jumping around with optimism that we're about to see more progress towards better representation of women in politics, and as part of that, a woman president of the US.
Well, steering back to the original question, the rise of the manosphere, the increased anti-gender rhetoric, and actually high-level, well-funded organisation, often funded from the United States, is now a factor in the democratic politics of a very large number of countries, certainly in Europe.
Scenario one, then, you think very unlikely to happen, that a woman simply gets elected through the direct route. Scenario two, which you call the dead body route, is the route by which a woman is elected as vice president, but then the president either dies in office or resigns or is forced out. I guess you see that as potentially more likely?
Well, it's slightly more likely, if only because a few more women have been nominated as vice president. And it's a fantastically important trope in some popular political films and film series about the United States. But it still isn't very likely. The closest that we've ever seen is Harris taking over Biden's nomination without going through the primary route in 2024. It's theoretically possible, but historically we can't find examples.
I think the difficulty is that you're much more likely to have a woman vice president on the Democrat side, and yet we've already described this issue that women Democrats are going to be considered to be more liberal than a male Democrat candidate, and so that might make it difficult with swing voters, and especially in this toxic environment we've described, where they are going to be the target for absolutely vociferous attacks if they're considered to be too feminist or too woke or whatever the rhetoric is. That's very difficult for a woman candidate to rebut.
Have we got to a stage where it's hard for the Democrats to put forward an all-male ticket? I mean, the last three Democratic tickets have both had a woman and a man. Is that a reason for at least a degree of hope?
I think that's a really good point, that the scenario 2 might happen rather than from, obviously, if Democrats are being motivated by electoral success, I think it's unlikely they will choose a woman candidate for president next time. But I think in terms of their base, not having a woman as the vice presidential candidate would be unacceptable. So I think you're right, that increases the probability of scenario 2, although of course we don't wish or hope for any dead bodies in politics.
You have an actual dead body scenario, which is the one that we've just been discussing there, scenario 2. But you also have what you call the political dead body scenario, which is essentially that one of the parties is squabbling between different male candidates and a woman manages to sneak through. It's maybe the Theresa May scenario for becoming president. Is that fair?
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May, and even dear old Liz Truss.
None of them were considered to be the main contenders. They all basically snuck through over the bodies of fighting men. Margaret Thatcher was considered, at the time, having a woman prime minister was widely ridiculed, let alone one who was the daughter of a grocer. And she was underestimated and she was highly organised, and she managed to climb over all the men, much to their horror. And I think we all know the story of Theresa May and David Cameron stepping down over Brexit, and she played her cards very close to her chest. She was Remain supporting, but very quietly so, and was able to step into the fractious party at that very difficult moment when Michael Gove had stabbed Boris Johnson violently in the back. So she was very much able to navigate through the melee that she was surrounded by. And then, Johnny, maybe you would like to tell us about the inspirational story of Liz Truss's ascendancy to Prime Minister.
I can't remember it.
Well, Liz Truss was behind. It was only when they got to the members that Liz Truss was the favoured candidate. Yeah. Amongst the party elite, she was never the preferred candidate. And it was the party members that chose Liz Truss. And at the time, there was some speculation, and there was certainly media coverage talking about Rishi Sunak not being really British or not being really English, which I found quite disgusting, to be honest. But I do wonder whether the third woman Prime Minister was more acceptable to some members than perhaps somebody whose commitment to the country was being questioned. I hope that's not the case. But she certainly wasn't the preferred candidate until we got to that moment. So all three of them, it's not something you'd have put money on, which is why I suppose we can't rule out that some metaphorical dead body scenario will happen in the US.
And what is the kind of equivalent process that leads to that outcome in the United States? Because, of course, there's not that kind of establishment lock that the MPs have in the UK in the initial process of selecting a Prime Minister.
Well, it would have to be after an election, or maybe even, as we saw in 2024, during an electoral campaign when something happens to the male presidential candidate or something happens to the male president. And then my understanding of the American Constitution, which is far from perfect, as I understand it, under almost all circumstances, the vice president takes over.
But that's scenario one. How could scenario two? So that's literal dead body. What about metaphorical dead body?
Good question.
I think what you're saying, it still applies. There has to be some big cock-up on a catastrophic scale.
I guess the Kamala Harris process by which she became the candidate is kind of a version of scenario 3, in that after the primary process was over, she was brought in at the last stage.
Yes.
And potentially you have a contested convention scenario as well, where you could get a woman coming through at the last moment to be nominated because there was deadlock between different.
Yeah, but it was actually all done and dusted in that particular case. But yes, that's one way. That's one way it could work. What I was actually struggling to think about was the kind of squabbling that gets a president impeached without quite impeaching the vice president at the same time. That would be another version of it.
Or somebody's past life coming to the fore during the primaries and then being ousted. I think there are various ways that a woman who's considered an unlikely choice could come to the fore.
Over there.
And certainly some of the politicians around the world that we are all witnessing at the moment are quite capable of revealing some of their own political dead bodies in the background that could create this kind of chaos that would allow women politicians to come through, I think.
Yeah, but I think or at least my understanding of what Alan's asking us, is about the difference between party government and presidential government and the American model, and then we're back to the outlier. But it's the whole way that the parties work and cohere in systems of party government is different.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, through various routes, it might be possible for a woman to become president. Not, you think, very likely in the way that we would really want, just through the direct woman actually being elected for this office, but potentially through some kind of other process. And you also talk in the article about the kind of woman who might be elected. I mean, one interesting thing, given the conversation that we've already had, is that you suggest that it's actually more likely that there would be a Republican elected as a woman rather than a Democrat.
We're not the first to say this. I mean, Bill Clinton said this recently. For all the reasons we've already outlined, for a woman to be number one on the ticket for the Democrats, I think is less likely in the near future, given recent history.
So partly just for that recent history, but also a woman will be perceived as being more left-wing and therefore will struggle to capture centrist voters, swing voters.
Yes, realistically, to take voters away from the contemporary Republicans, the Democrat candidate needs to be someone who will appeal to the marginal supporters of that party.
So we need a woman somehow to get through the Republican nomination process, and then potentially she has quite a strong chance, actually, because she would do a better job than many Republicans of capturing swing voters in the centre.
I think that's the ironic thing.
That's the essential argument. I mean, we realise it's a little thin.
You describe this concept that we're talking about here as the gender heuristic hypothesis.
Yes.
This idea that voters use candidates' gender as a shortcut for working out where they might sit politically.
Yes.
You know, this is grounded in lots of evidence. This is not thin. This is serious political science that we're drawing in.
Yes, but we're much more likely to use those kind of shortcuts, and we don't know much about a candidate.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of these experiments about the gender heuristic is in a context where they might be hypothetical or they might not be well known. The more and more we find about candidates, actually, the less those personal characteristics come to the fore. But of course, to make a difference in a close election, you only need a small number of individuals to have that kind of bias, really, assuming that somebody's gender reflects their politics in some way. So yeah, in the margins, it could really matter.
Yeah, I think so. It could matter in the margins, but it could also matter in terms of what you have to do to succeed in the candidature system in the Republican Party versus the Democrat Party. And one of the things that really struck me after the election, talking to my friends in the United States who were devastated, that one of the problems was that the voters didn't have the chance to get to know Harris. We know that she was suppressed as a politician by the Biden White House, and she didn't come to the attention of voters until quite late in the process. And for some reason that I really almost failed to understand, voters felt that they needed at least a couple more years of watching her to get to know her. And that was a strong argument after the election. And another strong argument was that she ran a terrible campaign, which we didn't see very much of while she was running the campaign. But afterwards, oh gosh, looking back on it, she ran a bad campaign. There were all kinds of things going on about it that I'm not sure were sensible or accurate.
But there's also an aspect around how we've discussed already how gender has become so much more politicised. 10, 15 years ago, I think there was a sense that many sensible people thought that gender equality was on a sort of inexorable march, and we were moving beyond sort of massive tensions around gender. Well, obviously, we've talked about how much that's changed, and gender has become so politicised in the US that I think for a woman to be a successful presidential candidate, she's got to traverse this incredibly difficult set of different constraints. And one of them is she needs to be seen to be feminine. She probably needs to look attractive. She needs to represent herself as a mother and as a traditional woman, at the same time as wielding power and military strength and might. And somehow I think that there is a model for a Republican woman to do that perhaps might be harder for a Democrat woman. Think Sarah Palin.
I am thinking Sarah Palin, and I think that's really important, and it's really hard to nail down, that the powerful woman, mother, warrior image, the Thatcher type of politician image, has got to be an easier role to adopt in the Republican Party that has quite special ideas about power that I think can accommodate the kind of mother, woman-led images of power as well.
Is there any chance that Trump's current antics might lead to a change in the kind of leader that people want, and that people might actually think, gosh, this chest-beating, power-hungry approach to leadership actually...
I mean, I think if you look at opinion polls, I think, yes, isn't there evidence that Trump is extremely unpopular? And so to what extent that will manifest itself in a change of direction and a movement away from this so-called strongman politics, we're not very good at predicting the future. I hope that our odds that we're saying it would take a miracle are wrong, and the sort of green shoots of democratic renewal that could be starting to spring forth, that is happening. I suppose right at this moment.
Well, is there evidence now that women are less likely to support Trump than men? Has that evidence changed?
No, but I think the thing is that
has it got worse?
I think the gender gap often looks slightly different between elections and actually on elections, and then during elections. And we know that the gender gap was very present in the last election, with more women supporting Harris and more men supporting Trump. The only thing is, it was about the same as it was in the previous few elections. But I think what's happened with the politics of division and polarisation is that people will vote for a candidate they really don't like and hold their nose because they so loathe the other side. And I think the perhaps moderation that you're describing, Alan, requires more individuals to think, well, actually, what are the characteristics of the individual office holder that I would like to support? And maybe I'm willing to support someone from an alternative party if they will uphold democratic principles and so on.
There is a case that this government is corrupt. It is anti-democratic. It is helping itself to the public purse in extraordinary ways. It is defying Congress and overcoming checks and balances that we thought had been in place for a long time, that might very well affect how people want to vote next time. My understanding, however, of the way opinion is working is that it's not so much that people are not horrified by the possibility that the things that the president has been accused of he's actually done. It's his hardcore supporters just don't believe it.
Final question then, we must wrap up. People who would like the United States to join all those countries that have managed to elect a woman as head of government, is there anything they can do? Is there anything they can push for that would change the system, that would change the institutional structures, that would change public attitudes, that would make it more likely?
We talked about the role of party finance, and it is out of control. Not only is it out of control in the US, it's affecting all the other democracies in the world. You know, the influence of a small number of extremely wealthy individuals on politics. Democracy is supposed to be about the majority, not about a small number of extremely wealthy influencers completely corrupting the democratic process. And I think that is the number one priority that would make a difference both to this question and a number of other really enormously important questions facing us.
I think I agree with that. It's not just the role of money in politics and the way it's become more and more distorted. It's also the way in which money is transcending political systems, transcending national borders, being concentrated in fewer and fewer and fewer and less reliable hands. And as far as I can see, and particularly from looking at the anti-gender movements and their financing, this is money that actually is not being used to promote women. And it may very well be used to attack women.
Well, thank you so much, Rosie and Johnny. You have given us a lot of depressing thoughts here, but also maybe some sources of hope. And also you have illustrated the ways in which proper political science research can be applied to a real world and very important questions. So thank you.
All the hope came from you.
Is that true?
I thought you were sounding pretty...
Oh, it's only because he cheered me up a bit. It's gone now.
We've been discussing the article, What Will It Take for a Woman to Become President of the United States, published in the Political Quarterly and currently available free of charge on Early View on the Political Quarterly website. We will, as ever, put the details in the show notes for this episode. And let me just remind you that the Political Quarterly, like this podcast, seeks to make the best research in political science accessible to wider audiences. Do go to its website to explore recent articles on issues as diverse as local government reform in England, the nature of power in Turkey, and the politics and policy of housing. And do also check out our own recent episode with Daniel Hind on his recent PQ article on the nature of the UK Constitution. This is our final episode in the current series. We're off for a little Easter break over the next few weeks, but we will be back at the end of April with more cutting-edge research on politics and policy. We have episodes cooking on topics such as justice in dementia care, LGBT activism in Zimbabwe, and government transparency in China. To make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.